A newborn baby fell from its burning mother's womb, only to be tossed right back into the flames by order of a judge. Many historical analyses suggest this was Queen Mary I turning a pregnant woman into a sacrificial torch to cure her own barren body. Desperate for a royal heir, she allegedly believed burning this family alive would cleanse her kingdom. It was a horrific ritual masked as justice, costing an infant its life. Some accounts suggest the real trigger was the Queen's hidden trauma from 2 phantom pregnancies that left her completely empty. Consumed by jealousy, Mary couldn't handle that a commoner like Perotine Massey could easily conceive a child. This deep maternal envy created a paranoid atmosphere, giving a ruthless local official the green light to burn 3 generations to ash. An innocent infant died simply to soothe the bitter despair of England's most powerful ruler. England was under the control of Queen Mary I. She was a devout traditional Catholic. Upon taking the throne, Mary made it her primary administration goal to reverse the Protestant reforms of the previous decades. These reforms had been instituted by her father, King Henry VIII, and advanced by her half-brother, King Edward VI. Mary's method for this reversal relied heavily on the legal system. Her government revived the old heresy laws. Religious nonconformity was legally classified as treason against the divine order and the state. The standard mandated punishment for a convicted heretic was execution by burning. The incident in question did not occur in London. It took place on the island of Guernsey. Guernsey is located in the Channel Islands, situated in the English Channel between the southern coast of England and the northern coast of France. This geographic reality gave the island a unique administrative identity. Culturally and linguistically, the population of Guernsey was Norman French. Politically and legally, however, the island was a dependency of the English crown. This dual identity created a specific jurisdictional zone. The physical distance from the capital meant that local magistrates operated with a significant degree of autonomy. London was far away, and communication was slow. Furthermore, Guernsey's proximity to France made it a natural haven for French Protestants fleeing religious persecution on the continent. The island quietly absorbed these refugees. Specifically, it became a refuge for Calvinists. Calvinism is a highly disciplined, rigorous branch of Protestantism. It firmly rejected many traditional Catholic rituals and papal authority. This created a tense, underlying religious conflict, just as Queen Mary's strict Catholic mandates were dispatched from London to the island's local government. Against this geopolitical backdrop lived a family of women in the parish of St. Peter Port. The head of the household was a widow named Catherine Cochet. She lived quietly with her 2 adult daughters, Guillemine Gilbert and Perotine Massey. They were a known Protestant household adhering to the Calvinist tradition. Perotine Massey was married to a Norman Calvinist minister named David Joraz. Historical parish records confirm their union. They were married at the local Castile church. The ceremony was officially officiated by a local minister named Noel Regnet. It was a standard, legally recognized marriage under the previous Protestant administration. However, the political climate shifted rapidly on the island as Queen Mary's policies took effect. Protestant ministers were identified as primary targets for arrest and interrogation. To avoid imminent capture, David Joris was forced to flee Guernsey. He traveled across the Channel to London, likely seeking anonymity in the larger, more chaotic city. He left behind his wife, Perotine. At the time of his departure, Perotine was heavily pregnant with their first child. Catherine, Guillemine, and Perotine remained together in St. Peter Port. without a male head of household present, and practicing a faith that was now illegal. Their social position was highly vulnerable. They attempted to navigate the changing laws by keeping a low profile and avoiding public religious disputes. The catalyst for their downfall was not a theological debate. It was a standard petty property crime. On May 17, 1556, a local woman named Vincente Gosset arrived at their home. Gosset was in possession of a silver cup. She offered to pawn this item to Perotine in exchange for a loan of 6 pence. Perotine examined the silver cup. She recognized the item. She knew that the cup rightfully belonged to a local citizen named Nicolas Le Couronnet. Realizing she was being asked to traffic in stolen goods, Perotine explicitly refused the transaction. She would not buy the cup. However, she did hand Vincente Gosset the 6 pence. Historical analysis of the event suggests Perotine likely gave Gosset the small sum of money simply to diffuse the situation and get the woman to leave her property. Once Gosset exited the house, Perotine followed standard civil protocol. She contacted the rightful owner. She reported the theft and the location of the stolen silver cup. This report prompted an immediate official response from the local government. A constable named Nicholas Carey was dispatched to investigate the theft. Constable Carey arrived at the home of Catherine Cochet. His initial mandate was strictly to investigate the stolen cup and interview the women regarding Vincente Gosset. However, during his time on the property, the parameters of Carey's investigation fundamentally shifted. Constable Carey reported finding suspicious items within the home. The surviving historical records do not provide a specific inventory of these items. Given the era and the family's religious background, researchers widely accept that Carey likely found Protestant religious tracts or unauthorized vernacular translations of Scripture. It is also possible he found items of wealth that he deemed inappropriate for their social standing, providing an excuse for seizure. Carey did not just recover the silver cup, he utilized the unspecified suspicious items as legal grounds for a broader arrest. Catherine Cochet, Perotine Massey, and Guillaume Gilbert were taken into custody. They were physically removed from their home by the authorities. The 3 women were transported to Castle Cornet, the island's primary fortification and prison. They were locked in the cold, damp dungeons of the castle to await a formal civil trial for theft and the possession of illicit goods. On June 5, 1556, the local Council of Citizens convened in St. Peter Port. Their objective was to hear the case of the stolen silver cup. The legal proceedings were straightforward and evidence-based. The authorities examined the evidence. They heard the testimonies regarding the transaction between Vincente Gosset and Perotine Massey. The civil court reached a swift and accurate conclusion. The truth came to light. Catherine Cochet, Guillaume Gilbert, and Perotine Massey were completely exonerated of all theft charges. The court determined they had no intent to steal, conceal, or fence the silver cup. The true culprit, Vincente Gosset, was found guilty of the theft. The court issued her punishment in strict accordance with local Tudor-era statutes. Gosset's punishment was severe, reflecting the harsh judicial standards of the time. She was publicly whipped. She was then nailed to a pillory by her ear. Finally, she was permanently banished from the island of Guernsey. Under standard civil law, Catherine, Guillaume, and Perotine should have been released immediately following this verdict. They had been thoroughly proven innocent of the crime for which they were initially arrested. However, the local authorities did not allow them to return home. They were remanded back to the dungeons of Castle Cornet. While the women had been confined during the theft investigation, the nature of their detention had drastically changed. The civil investigation into a stolen cup was actively being transformed into a religious inquisition. This shift was driven by the local populace and capitalized upon by ambitious local officials. In the highly paranoid atmosphere of Marian England, citizens routinely monitored their neighbors for religious nonconformity. Local informants notified the authorities regarding the family. They reported that Catherine, Perotine, and Guillemine had not been attending the mandatory Catholic Mass. For the local government, this constituted actionable intelligence. The Marian heresy laws made religious conformity a matter of strict state security. Two powerful men controlled Guernsey's legal and spiritual infrastructure. They recognized an opportunity to enforce these laws and consolidate their own authority. The first was Bailiff Helier Gosselin. He was the highest secular official on the island. He was responsible for enforcing civil law and managing property disputes. The second was Dean Jacques Amy. He was the highest ecclesiastical official on the island. He was responsible for enforcing church doctrine and identifying heretics. Bailiff Gosselin and Dean Amy coordinated to move the jurisdiction of the case. They transferred the three women from the civil court directly to the ecclesiastical court. A dispute over a pawned cup was now officially a trial for heresy. Dean Jacques Amy took charge of the religious questioning. The three women were brought before the ecclesiastical authorities to answer for their spiritual practices. The interrogation records demonstrate that Catherine, Guillemine, and Perotine attempted to navigate the questioning carefully. They were terrified, but they understood the lethal consequences of a heresy conviction. When questioned about their faith, they did not offer radical theological arguments or defiance. Instead, they focused entirely on their civic loyalty. They stated clearly and repeatedly that they were loyal subjects of Queen Mary. They emphasized their willingness to obey her laws and conform to state mandates. They explained their previous actions logically. They stated that their past Protestant practices were simply an adherence to the laws set down by the previous monarch, King Edward VI. They asked the court for mercy. They requested the opportunity to conform to the current Catholic legal requirements. Dean Amy firmly rejected their defense. The ecclesiastical court during this period did not require proof of active seditious preaching to secure a conviction. The simple admission of past Protestant practices, combined with their documented absence from the Catholic Mass, was deemed legally sufficient. Dean Amy ignored their pleas for mercy. Without engaging in further theological debate, and without offering the women a standard period for recantation, Dean Amy made his ruling. He officially pronounced Catherine Cochet and her two daughters to be heretics against the church. Once the ecclesiastical court declared an individual a heretic, church law required them to be handed back to the secular authorities. The church identified the criminal. The state determined and carried out the physical punishment. Dean Amy transferred the condemned women back into the custody of Bailiff Helier Gosselin. The case was now back in secular hands for sentencing. On July 17, 1556, Bailiff Helier Gosselin convened a secular court. He was joined by 10 local jurats. These jurats were sworn municipal officers, responsible for administering justice alongside the bailiff. The speed and the nature of their actions that day directly violated established English legal protocols. Under English law during the Tudor period, local magistrates did not have the unilateral authority to execute citizens for heresy. Executing someone for religious crimes required a specific legal writ from London. This document was called the De Heretico Comburendo. The issuance of this writ ensured that the crown officially reviewed and sanctioned the execution. Bailiff Gosselin did not wait for this writ to arrive from the mainland. He bypassed the central authority in London entirely. Gosselin and the 10 jurats officially condemned the 3 women to be burned at the stake. Furthermore, Gosselin immediately ordered the confiscation of all their property. The assets of the Cochet family were transferred directly to the state. On a local level, this meant the assets fell entirely under the control of Gosselin and his administrative allies. Why would Gosselin act so recklessly and illegally? Historical analysis points to 2 primary motivations: financial greed and political ambition. By executing the women quickly and bypassing London's oversight, the local authorities could immediately seize and distribute the family's assets without interference from the crown. Secondly, the Marian regime in London was demanding strict adherence to Catholicism across all territories. By demonstrating extreme prejudice against local Protestants, Gosselin was sending a clear signal. He was demonstrating his fanatical loyalty to Queen Mary's regime. This action secured and consolidated his own political power on the island. To fully grasp the environment that allowed such a rushed and illegal execution, we must look across the English Channel. We must examine the specific circumstances surrounding Queen Mary herself. Mary Tudor, often remembered historically as Bloody Mary, was a monarch carrying severe psychological and physical trauma. Her primary objective, aside from restoring the Catholic faith, was to produce a Catholic heir. An heir would secure her political legacy. More importantly to Mary, an heir would prevent her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth from legally taking the throne. In 1554, and again in 1557, Mary experienced severe medical episodes. Her period stopped. Her abdomen swelled. She reportedly even produced milk. The royal court and the entire nation rejoiced. They actively prepared for the birth of a prince. However, months passed and no child was born. Her physical symptoms eventually subsided and her abdomen flattened. Medical historians classify these events as pseudocyesis, commonly known as phantom pregnancies. The psychological devastation of these false pregnancies completely broke Mary's morale. In the 16th century, human fertility was widely interpreted as a direct reflection of divine favor. A monarch's inability to produce an heir was often viewed as a spiritual failing or a divine curse. Queen Mary could not medically understand her condition. She sought a theological explanation for why God would deny her a child. In her grief and escalating paranoia, many historians argue Mary arrived at a chilling conclusion. She believed that God was actively punishing her because she had not been ruthless enough in cleansing England of Protestant heretics. This specific mindset created a highly dangerous environment for women like Perotine Massey. Historians often refer to this psychological concept as a form of maternal envy combined with ritualistic purging. The very existence of fertile, pregnant Protestant women presented a stark theological contradiction to the Marian regime. From the perspective of the crown's extreme religious ideology, it was a profound insult. How could God bless a convicted heretic with a healthy child while leaving the faithful Catholic queen completely barren? The burnings at the stake were implemented as legal punishments, but they also functioned as spiritual purifications for the regime. They operated on the belief that destroying the tainted blood of heretics would appease an angry God. The administration believed that through this extreme purification, the queen might finally be permitted to conceive. It was a deadly combination of absolute political power and severe psychological projection. Perotine Massey, heavily pregnant and officially convicted of heresy by a corrupt local court, was caught directly in the crosshairs of this national trauma. The initial arrest of the Cochet family was based strictly on a civil property dispute. However, as the local authorities processed the theft investigation, the case was quickly redirected by the broader religious enforcement gripping the Tudor state. On the morning of July 18, 1556, the capital sentence was carried out. Perotine Massey, her mother Catherine, and her sister Guillemine were led out of the dungeons of Castle Cornet. They were marched to a designated execution site. This location was called Tower Hill, situated specifically at the Place du Bouillon in St. Peter Port. A massive crowd of local citizens had gathered to witness the event. 3 wooden stakes had been driven firmly into the ground. The municipal guards tied Catherine, the mother, to the center stake. They secured her daughters, Perotine and Guillemine, to the stakes on either side of her. There was a customary act of mercy integrated into Tudor-era executions. The executioner would typically strangle the condemned victims with a rope before lighting the fire. This protocol was designed to ensure the prisoners were dead or unconscious before the flames reached their physical bodies. The executioner on duty that day was Pierre Carapal. He stepped forward to perform this strangulation procedure. He placed the heavy ropes around the necks of the 3 women. He pulled the ropes backward to tighten them. However, the execution equipment failed. The ropes broke under the sudden tension. Because of this mechanical failure, Catherine, Guillemine, and Perotine fell forward. They collapsed directly into the piled wood at the base of the stakes. They were completely alive and entirely conscious as the executioners applied torches to the pyre. The fire roared to life. The screams of the women filled the air as the wood ignited. But what happened next elevated this execution from a local tragedy to a major international scandal. Perotine Massey was in the final stages of her pregnancy. As the flames engulfed her, the extreme heat of the fire caused a massive thermal shock to her body. Her uterus contracted violently due to the acute heat-induced trauma. Her belly burst open. A baby boy was expelled from her body. The infant fell through the burning wood. He landed on the ground at the outer edge of the flames. The crowd gasped. The baby was alive. Witnesses clearly heard the newborn infant crying. For a brief moment, a bystander intervened. A man in the crowd named William House broke through the line of municipal guards. He was a local gunner and surgeon. He reached into the scorching heat. He pulled the crying infant from the ashes and laid the baby on the cool grass. William House picked up the newborn. He carried the child directly to Bailiff Hellyer Gosselin. Gosselin was the presiding secular official managing the execution on behalf of the state. House presented the baby to him. House likely expected that Gosselin would spare the life of an innocent newborn who had just miraculously survived the fire. Gosselin looked at the child. He did not see a miracle. He operated strictly under the ideology of the Marian heresy laws. He saw the offspring of a convicted heretic. "Cast it back," Gosselin ordered. He justified his command by stating that the baby carried the tainted blood of its mother. According to his political and religious logic, the infant was a heretic by birth. The child had to be purged. The guards obeyed the bailiff's command. They took the crying newborn boy from William House. They threw the infant back into the center of the inferno. The baby burned to death alongside his mother, his aunt, and his grandmother. The Guernsey execution was a profound violation of both human decency and established English common law. Under the legal system of the time, A pregnant woman sentenced to death possessed a specific civil right. This legal maneuver was known as the right to plead the belly. This meant a pregnant woman's execution would be officially delayed by the court until after she had given birth. The law formally recognized that an unborn child was entirely innocent of the mother's crimes. Why wasn't Perotine granted this basic legal right? There are several historical arguments among scholars. Some suggest Perotine, in her terror and isolation in the dungeon, did not realize the advanced stage of her pregnancy. Others believe she chose to stay silent out of pure fear. A third, highly plausible argument focuses directly on Bailiff Hellier Gosselin. This historical theory suggests Perotine did inform her jailers of her condition, but Gosselin intentionally ignored her. He was eager to execute the women quickly. A legal delay for childbirth would have prevented him from immediately confiscating their property before higher officials in London could intervene. When documented news of the baby's murder reached the English mainland, it caused an immediate sensation. It was a massive public relations disaster for the Catholic Church and the administration of Queen Mary. Catholic apologists became desperate to control the public narrative. They went on the offensive. A prominent Catholic scholar named Thomas Harding launched a vicious smear campaign against Perotine Massey. Harding argued that the church and the local courts were not to blame for the baby's death. Instead, he blamed Perotine entirely. He publicly accused her of being a woman of loose morals. Harding suggested that Perotine intentionally hid her pregnancy from the bailiff because the child was illegitimate. He essentially accused her of whoredom. He argued she committed the murder of her own child by failing to declare her pregnancy to the authorities. But Harding's lies did not stand up to rigorous scrutiny. A Protestant historian and martyrologist named John Fox took up Perotine's cause. Fox investigated the Guernsey burnings meticulously. He traveled and gathered primary source evidence. Fox successfully located the official parish registers. He found the marriage documents from the Castile Church. He definitively proved that Perotine was legally married to the Calvinist minister David Joris. This physical evidence completely dismantled Harding's claims of illegitimacy. Fox included the detailed, verified story of Perotine Massey in his monumental historical work. This book was formally titled Actes and Monuments, widely known by the public as Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was published in English in 1563. Fox didn't just tell the written story. He included a vivid, terrifying, woodcut illustration. This visual image clearly showed the three women burning at the stakes and the newborn baby falling into the flames. This book became the second most widely read book in England, right after the Authorized Bible. The story of the Guernsey baby became the ultimate symbol of Catholic cruelty during this political era. The publication destroyed Thomas Harding's defensive arguments. It permanently cemented Queen Mary's historical nickname as Bloody Mary. The image of that baby being tossed back into the fire did more to turn the English public against Catholicism than any theological sermon could achieve. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. Queen Mary died in November 1558. Her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth I, ascended to the throne. In 1562, a man named Matthew Cochet filed a formal legal petition with Queen Elizabeth's government. He was the brother of the murdered Catherine Cochet. He demanded a new official investigation into the execution of his sister and his two nieces. Cochet specifically pointed out that the murder of the newborn baby was an illegal extrajudicial killing. The baby had never been tried or convicted of a crime by any court. He also formally protested the unlawful seizure of their family estate by the bailiff. Elizabeth's government launched a royal inquiry. The truth about Bailiff Helier Gosselin and Dean Jacques Amy was finally dragged into the light. The official investigation revealed the vast extent of their local corruption. It proved that Gosselin had bypassed royal authority. He acted illegally by executing the women without the required royal writ from London. The inquiry confirmed he used the heresy laws specifically to line his own pockets by seizing the women's personal estates. The Crown took immediate punitive action against the men. Dean Jacques Amy was permanently stripped of his ecclesiastical titles. He was subsequently thrown into prison. Helier Gosselin was officially fired from his position as bailiff and publicly disgraced. However, the final resolution of the case reflects the cold, calculating nature of Tudor geopolitical strategy. Gosselin and the jurats who had condemned the women were legally guilty of murder. But Queen Elizabeth I was trying to stabilize a politically fractured nation. Guernsey was a vital strategic military outpost. It guarded the English Channel against potential French military incursions. If Elizabeth executed the entire local government of Guernsey, it could plunge the island's administration into chaos. This instability would leave it highly vulnerable to a French invasion. In 1563, Elizabeth prioritized national security over absolute justice. She issued a formal royal pardon to Helier Gosselin and the involved jurats. They narrowly escaped the hangman's noose, but their political careers and public reputations were forever ruined. Furthermore, the Crown ordered that the confiscated property and financial assets had to be returned in full to Matthew Cochet. The extreme brutality of the execution completely backfired on local Catholic authorities. Instead of terrifying the population into submission, it galvanized the Guernsey citizens against them. Calvinism took deep, unshakable root on the island, and Guernsey remained a fiercely Protestant stronghold for centuries. On April 24th, 1999, more than 400 years after the fires went out, a memorial plaque was finally unveiled on the steps of Tower Hill in St. Peter Port. It stands near the exact spot where the 3 women and the newborn baby lost their lives. The Guernsey martyrs were not powerful politicians or famous theologians. They were a mother, 2 daughters, and a child who lived for only a few seconds. Their suffering changed the course of history, serving as a permanent historical record of the fragility of human life when corrupted state authorities decide you are an enemy. Once the ecclesiastical court declared the women heretics, the church's role in the legal process ended. The case was transferred back to the secular authorities, setting the stage for a rushed sentencing process that bypassed standard legal protocols. The immediate aftermath of the execution in St. Peter Port created a severe legal and political crisis. The local administration had clearly overstepped its jurisdictional boundaries. Bailiff Helier Gosselin and Dean Jacques Amy had weaponized religious statutes for personal financial gain. They successfully eliminated 3 citizens and confiscated their property. However, they failed to account for the meticulous record-keeping of the Tudor state and the persistence of the victim's surviving family. Matthew Cochet was the brother of Catherine Cochet. He lived outside the immediate reach of the Guernsey bailiff. Following the execution of his sister and 2 nieces, he initiated a formal legal challenge. He did not base his challenge on theological arguments or religious sympathy. He based it strictly on property law and procedural violations. Under English common law, the seizure of the Cochet's estate was illegal without a specific royal writ. Bailiff Gosselin had bypassed authorities in London to expedite the confiscation of their assets. Matthew Cochet recognized this critical procedural error. He spent the next several years quietly gathering documentation to prove the bailiff's actions were unlawful. His legal efforts gained significant traction following the death of Queen Mary I in November 1558. Queen Elizabeth I ascended to the throne. Her new administration was Protestant. They were highly motivated to investigate and expose the abuses of the previous Catholic regime. In 1562, Matthew Cochet officially submitted his documented petition to the Queen's legal commissioners. He demanded the full restitution of his family's property. He also demanded a formal royal inquiry into the extrajudicial killing of the newborn infant. The Elizabethan government responded by launching a comprehensive royal inquiry. They dispatched official commissioners to the island of Guernsey. Their specific mandate was to review the local court records and interview the surviving witnesses. The subsequent investigation revealed a clear and undeniable pattern of local corruption. The royal commissioners discovered that Bailiff Gosselin had intentionally ignored standard judicial procedures. He had rushed the sentencing phase of the trial. He had executed the women without securing the required de heretico comburendo writ from the capital. The royal inquiry also focused heavily on the death of the infant at the stake. The commissioners established that the newborn had never been formally accused of heresy. The child had not been tried in any court. The direct order from Gosselin to throw the infant back into the fire was legally determined to be an act of murder. It fell completely outside the bounds of the established heresy statutes. Dean Jacques Amy was also subjected to the investigation. The commissioners found that his ecclesiastical court had failed to follow proper canonical procedures. He had not offered the three women a standard, legally required period to recant their alleged heretical beliefs before condemning them. The findings of the royal inquiry were compiled and forwarded to London. The Crown took decisive punitive action against the local officials. Dean Jacques Amy was arrested by state authorities. He was transported to Castle Cornet. This was the exact same prison facility where he had previously confined the Cochet family. He was officially stripped of all his ecclesiastical titles and local church beneficias. He remained incarcerated, losing all his local influence and authority. Bailiff Helier Gosselin faced severe political and professional consequences. He was officially dismissed from his position as the highest secular official on the island. He was publicly disgraced and permanently lost his standing in the local government. The 10 local jurats who had collaborated with Gosselin were also held accountable by the commissioners. They were required to publicly acknowledge their direct role in the illegal execution and the unlawful seizure of property. However, the Elizabethan administration ultimately prioritized geopolitical stability over criminal prosecution. Guernsey was a critical defensive military outpost in the English Channel. It protected the English mainland from French naval forces. Executing the entire former leadership of the island would create a severe local power vacuum. This administrative instability could easily provoke a French invasion. Queen Elizabeth I issued a formal royal pardon in 1563. The pardon explicitly covered the murder of the infant and the illegal execution of the women. Gosselin and the jurats were spared from the death penalty due to these broader national security concerns. The royal pardon, however, came with strict financial conditions attached. The crown ordered Gosselin and his administrative associates to surrender all the property and financial assets they had confiscated from the Cochet family. The entire estate was fully restored to Matthew Cochet, while the legal battle secured the return of the property. The historical preservation of the event was secured by John Fox. He was an English historian compiling a comprehensive verified record of Marian persecutions. Fox understood the critical importance of verifiable physical evidence. He traveled directly to Guernsey to conduct his own independent historical investigation. He interviewed eyewitnesses, including William House, the local gunner who had attempted to save the infant from the fire. Fox also secured the most critical piece of physical evidence required to clear the family's name. He located the official parish registers at the Castell Church. These documents prove that Perotine Massey was legally married to the minister David Jores. This physical evidence directly refuted the Catholic apologists who claimed the infant was illegitimate. It proved Perotine had no moral reason to hide her pregnancy, dismantling the state's defensive narrative. Fox published his verified findings in 1563. His work included a highly detailed account of the Guernsey execution. It also featured a woodcut illustration depicting the precise events at the Place du Bouillon. This mass publication ensured the illegal actions of Gosselin and Amy became a matter of permanent public record. It shifted the public narrative away from abstract theological disputes. It focused the public's attention directly on the legal and moral failures of the local judicial authorities. The legal mechanisms surrounding pregnant prisoners in England also underwent significant review following this exposure. The failure to grant Perotine Massey her civil right to plead the belly highlighted a severe flaw in local judicial oversight. English common law subsequently standardized the mandatory use of a jury of matrons. This was a strict procedural safeguard. If a condemned female prisoner claimed to be pregnant, the court was legally required to halt all execution proceedings immediately. The court would then appoint a panel of respected local women to physically examine the prisoner. If they confirmed the pregnancy, the law mandated an automatic stay of execution until after the child was safely delivered. This requirement removed the life or death decision entirely from the discretion of a single potentially corrupt magistrate. The legacy of the Guernsey event is primarily structural and legal. The incident accelerated the centralization of royal judicial authority in London. It demonstrated the extreme dangers of allowing local officials to enforce national mandates without strict oversight, the verified historical record documents, the fatal consequences of political corruption, and remains independent of the theological debates of the Tudor era. This illegal death sentence was a direct result of the local magistrates exploiting the strict religious policies of Queen Mary. These national policies and local ambitions culminated on the morning of the execution, turning a state punishment into a severe legal and human tragedy. The legacy of Perotine Massey and her family is etched deep into the stone of Guernsey. The physical and emotional scars left by the events of July 1556 fundamentally altered the trajectory of the island's history. The sheer brutality of their execution backfired entirely on the local Catholic authorities. Bailiff Elier Gosselin and Dean Jacques Amy had intended to use the fires at the Place du Bouillon as a tool of absolute state terror. They believed that by publicly destroying a family, they would force the rest of the island into strict religious compliance. Instead of terrifying the population into submission, it galvanized them. The citizens of Guernsey had witnessed the mechanical failure of the ropes, the traumatic birth of the infant, and the cold-blooded murder of the newborn. This public spectacle did not inspire religious devotion. It inspired deep generational outrage against the Marian regime. Consequently, Calvinism took deep, unshakable root on the island. The local population viewed the Catholic administration not as spiritual leaders, but as corrupt, violent oppressors. When the Elizabethan religious settlement was introduced a few years later, Guernsey did not just accept moderate Anglican Protestantism. Guernsey remained a fiercely Protestant stronghold for centuries. The island became a highly fortified sanctuary for French Huguenots who were fleeing similar religious persecutions on the European continent. The local culture, deeply traumatized by the Marian burnings, fully embraced the rigorous, disciplined theology of John Calvin, creating a distinct religious identity that separated them from both Catholic France and Anglican England. The physical memory of the event was also carefully preserved by the local community. For generations, the story of the three women and the infant was passed down through oral tradition and verified historical texts. The site of the execution remained a potent, lingering symbol of resistance against tyranny. On April the 24th, 1999, more than 400 years after the fires went out, the island finally offered a formal physical acknowledgement of the tragedy. A memorial plaque was officially unveiled to the public in St. Peter Port. The bronze plaque was placed directly on the steps of Tower Hill. It stands near the exact spot where the three women and the newborn baby lost their lives. This modern memorial serves as a permanent historical marker, ensuring that the names of Catherine Cochet, Guillemine Gilbert, Perotine Massey, and her unnamed son are permanently integrated into the island's public geography. The story of Perotine Massey is difficult to hear. It directly challenges our understanding of justice and forces us to look directly at the devastating consequences of unchecked administrative power. It forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. The actions of Bailiff Gosselin, who ordered an infant thrown into a fire to secure confiscated property, demonstrate the terrifying depths of bureaucratic cruelty. It shows us what happens when religious zealotry is weaponized by greedy, corrupt men. The heresy laws of the Tudor era were designed by the Crown as spiritual guidelines, but in Guernsey, they were utilized by local officials as legal loopholes for financial theft and political consolidation. It shows us the terrifying fragility of life when the state decides you are an enemy. The Cochet family was entirely innocent of the initial theft charge, yet they were systematically destroyed by a legal system that prioritized ideological conformity over factual innocence and basic civil rights. But it also shows us something else. Amidst the extreme horror of the execution, there were documented acts of profound human decency that defied the state's brutal mandates. It shows us William House, a simple gunner, rushing into a fire to save a baby he didn't know. His physical intervention was an act of extreme spontaneous bravery. He risked his own life and directly defied the bailiff's authority simply to rescue an innocent life from the flames. It shows us Matthew Cochet fighting for years to clear his family's name. He did not accept the state's unjust verdict. He navigated a complex and dangerous legal system, patiently compiling evidence until he successfully forced a royal inquiry that finally exposed the local corruption to the crown. And it shows us that while regimes rise and fall, and while tyrants try to burn the truth has a way of surviving the flames. the meticulous, evidence-based investigations by John Fox, and the persistent legal petitions of the surviving family ensured that the Marian administration could not erase their crimes from the permanent historical record. The Guernsey martyrs were not powerful politicians or famous theologians. They held no political office, they commanded no armies, and they wrote no sweeping religious treatises to influence the masses. They were a mother, 2 daughters, and a child who lived for only a few seconds. They were private citizens whose quiet lives were violently interrupted by the shifting political winds of the Tudor era. But their suffering changed the course of history. The documentation of their deaths directly influenced the reform of English common law, specifically strengthening the legal protections and civil rights for pregnant prisoners. Their story stands as a permanent historical mechanism, reminding us that true morality isn't found in the decrees of a monarch or the dogmas of a court. True morality is found in the simple, quiet courage of those who refuse to be forgotten. The execution of the 3 women and the newborn infant was a clear violation of established English common law. Word of this extrajudicial killing quickly spread beyond Guernsey, creating a significant public relations crisis for the Marian regime and prompting rigorous independent investigations. The historical reverberations of the Guernsey execution extended far beyond the immediate Tudor period. To understand the true scale of its impact, we must examine how the event was codified into the English national identity. This codification was primarily achieved through the advent of the mass printing press. When John Fox published his verified account in 1563, he utilized a relatively new form of mass communication. His text, formally titled Actes and Monuments, was a massive multi-volume undertaking. The government of Queen Elizabeth I quickly recognized the political utility of this historical record. The Elizabethan administration ordered that a copy of Fox's work be placed in every cathedral church in England. Church officials were instructed to chain the book to a lectern. It was placed directly alongside the authorized English Bible. This placement guaranteed maximum public exposure. In an era before mass literacy, citizens would gather in the churches to hear the text read aloud. The book became a foundational pillar of English Protestant identity. It systematically documented the Marian persecutions, ensuring the public never forgot the extreme measures of the previous Catholic administration. The specific inclusion of the Guernsey martyrs within this text was a highly calculated decision. John Fox understood the psychological impact of visual evidence. He commissioned specialized woodcuts to accompany the written narratives. The woodcut depicting the execution at the Place de Bouillon was particularly visceral. It provided a visual anchor for the written testimony. For the illiterate population of England, this image served as undeniable proof of judicial overreach and religious cruelty. The image of the newborn infant falling from the flames became an iconic piece of early political media. It was utilized to justify anti-Catholic legislation for the next century. The state utilized the factual tragedy of Perotine Massey to successfully unify a fractured nation against a common ideological enemy. Beyond public propaganda, the Guernsey case directly influenced the strict codification of English common law. The failure of Bailiff Helier Gosselin to recognize Perotine's pregnancy exposed a fatal weakness in local judicial discretion. Legal scholars and jurists recognized that the system required standardized biological safeguards to prevent the execution of innocent unborn children. This realization led to the formal institutionalization of the jury of matrons. This legal mechanism was rooted in medieval practice but became strictly codified following the Marian abuses. When a condemned female prisoner claimed to be pregnant, the local magistrate was immediately stripped of his unilateral execution authority. The court was legally obligated to issue a redevant inspiciendo. This Latin legal term translates to of inspecting the belly. The court would then summon a panel of 12 local married women. These women were considered legal experts in matters of childbirth and anatomy. The 12 matrons would physically examine the condemned prisoner in a private, secure setting. They were tasked with determining if the woman was quick with child. In historical medical terms, this meant they needed to verify if the fetus was actively moving, which typically occurs around the 4th month of pregnancy. If the jury of matrons delivered a positive verdict, the execution was automatically stayed by the state. The execution was legally delayed until after the woman had safely delivered the child. Following the delivery, the infant was typically handed over to a wet nurse or local parish authorities to be raised. Only after the biological safety of the child was secured could the state proceed with the mother's capital sentence. The Guernsey execution served as the ultimate grim case study for why this legal procedure was absolutely mandatory. It established a permanent legal precedent, prioritizing the life of the unconvicted infant over the immediate judicial execution of the mother. The geopolitical consequences for the island of Guernsey were equally profound. The trauma of the 1556 execution permanently severed the island's ideological ties to conservative traditional authority. The local population had witnessed the absolute failure of the Marian administration to protect its own citizens from corrupt magistrates. This trauma forged a distinct, heavily militarized Protestant culture on the island. Guernsey fully adopted the strict, egalitarian structures of Calvinism. They rejected the hierarchical authority of bishops and centralized church governance. This independent religious identity had massive political implications less than a century later. When the English Civil War erupted in 1642, the Channel Islands were forced to choose sides. The neighboring island of Jersey remained fiercely loyal to King Charles I and the Royalist cause. Guernsey, however, took a radically different path. The citizens remembered the historical abuses of absolute monarchical power. They vividly remembered the unchecked authority of Bailiff Gosselin operating under Queen Mary's mandate. Guernsey officially declared its support for the parliamentarians. They sided with Oliver Cromwell against the English crown. The island became a crucial naval stronghold for the parliamentary fleet, actively disrupting royalist supply lines in the English Channel. The ideological seeds for this organized rebellion were planted at the Place du Bouillon. The execution of the Cochet family taught the islanders a permanent political lesson. They learned that unquestioning loyalty to a centralized crown could result in localized tyranny and the murder of their own citizens. By siding with Parliament, the citizens of Guernsey were actively attempting to dismantle the type of absolute royal authority that had permitted the 1556 burnings. The deaths of Catherine, Guillemine, Perotine, and the infant were not isolated historical anomalies. They were the direct catalyst for a generational shift in political alignment. Today, the legal and historical archives of the Tudor period continue to be analyzed by modern scholars. The trial records, the property confiscation logs, and the subsequent royal pardons provide a comprehensive view of 16th century jurisprudence. The survival of these specific documents is a testament to the meticulous bureaucratic nature of the English state. Even during its most volatile periods, the state meticulously recorded the very crimes it committed against its own people, leaving a permanent paper trail of the events. The case of the Guernsey martyrs is now frequently utilized in modern academic studies. It serves as a primary historical reference point for analyzing the intersections of gender, law, and religious extremism in early modern Europe. Scholars examine the case to understand how pregnant women navigated the heavily patriarchal legal systems of the Tudor era. It provides concrete, verified data on how local administrators weaponized national laws to execute personal vendettas and seize private wealth. Furthermore, it remains a vital case study in the evolution of human rights. The formalization of the jury of matrons and the strict legal protections for the unborn represent early structural attempts by the state to limit its own power. The tragic loss of the Guernsey family forced the legal system to evolve. Their deaths established physical and legal boundaries that prevented local magistrates from ever again operating with absolute, unchecked, lethal authority. The historical record demonstrates that legal progress often requires a catastrophic catalyst. In the mid-16th century, that catalyst was the smoke rising from Tower Hill in St. Peter Port. The legal and cultural consequences of that specific event echoed through the centuries, directly shaping the foundational laws and political identities of the modern English state. The meticulous documentation by investigators like John Fox preserved the facts of the case during the Marian era. When Queen Mary died and the administration of Queen Elizabeth took power, the surviving family members finally had the political opportunity to demand a formal legal reckoning. The successful petition by Matthew Cochet in 1562 initiated an unprecedented legal review. The Elizabethan government was determined to expose Marian abuses, but doing so on the semi-autonomous island of Guernsey required a specialized approach. The Crown dispatched a royal commission to cross the English Channel. These commissioners were granted sweeping authority to bypass the local magistrates. Their primary objective was to audit the financial and legal records of Bailiff Hellyer Gosselin. When the royal investigators arrived in St. Peter Port, they immediately secured the municipal archives. They were looking for the specific paper trail related to the Cochet estate. Tudor bureaucracy was exceptionally thorough. Even when recording illegal acts, Gosselin had meticulously documented the confiscation of the family's property. He had recorded the inventory of their home, the valuation of their goods, and the subsequent distribution of these assets among his local political allies. This financial ledger became the primary evidence against him. It proved that the heresy trial was financially motivated. The rapid transition from a civil dispute over a sixpence pawn transaction to a triple execution was driven by the calculated valuation of the widow's estate. The commissioners also focused on the procedural timeline. They cross-referenced the date of Dean Jacques Amy's ecclesiastical condemnation with the date of the execution at the Place du Bouillon. The timeline proved that Gosselin had executed the sentence with deliberate, unlawful speed. He had not allowed the required administrative window for the royal writ to be requested, let alone delivered from London. The investigation then turned to the most severe violation, the death of the infant. The commissioners interviewed the citizens who had attended the execution. They required sworn testimonies under the threat of perjury. They recorded the exact sequence of events. They documented the mechanical failure of the ropes. They recorded the birth of the child into the flames. Most importantly, They secured the testimony of William House, the gunner who had temporarily rescued the newborn. The sworn statements confirmed that Gosselin gave a direct verbal order to throw the living infant back into the pyre. The commissioners legally classified this specific action as an extrajudicial killing. The infant had not been baptized, but under English common law, the child was a living citizen. The baby had never been indicted by a grand jury, tried by a secular court, or condemned by an ecclesiastical tribunal. Gosselin's order was an act of murder committed under the color of law. The findings of the Royal Commission were irrefutable. They presented a documented case of systemic local corruption. The bailiff and the dean had colluded to weaponize national religious statutes to achieve personal enrichment and eliminate a vulnerable family. These findings were presented directly to Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council in London. The council faced a complex geopolitical dilemma. The evidence demanded the execution of Gosselin and his jurats for murder. However, Guernsey's strategic location dictated a different outcome. The island was a crucial early warning outpost against French naval movements. Executing the entire administrative body of the island would decimate the local government. It would create a severe power vacuum and destabilize the island's defenses. The Privy Council advised Queen Elizabeth to prioritize national security over local justice. The Crown issued the 1563 royal pardon to prevent a potential French military incursion. While Gosselin escaped the death penalty, the Crown ensured he did not profit from his crimes. The royal decree mandated the immediate, full restitution of the Cochet estate. Every item of value, every piece of real estate, and all financial assets confiscated by the bailiff had to be returned to Matthew Cochet. The state effectively bankrupted Gosselin to repay the stolen inheritance. This financial restitution was a rare legal victory in the Tudor era. It legally invalidated the heresy conviction by reversing the standard penalty of asset forfeiture. The thoroughness of the Royal Commission also provided the raw data for historians like John Fox. Without the official government investigation, the specific details of the trial, the timeline, and the financial motives might have been lost to local rumor. The government's intervention ensured that the Guernsey execution was permanently catalogued as an administrative and moral failure of the Marian regime. The state officially recognized that the local authorities had utilized religious zealotry as a mask for lethal corruption. The historical record of Perotine Massey, her family, and the newborn infant remains intact today because the legal system eventually functioned as designed. The state investigated its own agents. It documented their abuses. It forced the restitution of stolen property. The tragedy of the Guernsey martyrs highlights the absolute necessity of strict judicial oversight. It demonstrates that when local magistrates operate without accountability, the most vulnerable citizens pay the ultimate price. The meticulous documentation of this event ensures that the reality of their suffering and the corruption that caused it will never be erased from the public record. The Elizabethan royal inquiry successfully exposed the local corruption and forced the restitution of the family's property. Beyond this immediate legal resolution, the execution left a permanent mark on the island's culture, altering its religious and political identity for the next several centuries. The theological implications of the Guernsey execution struck at the very heart of 16th century Christian doctrine. The newborn infant, having lived for only a few seconds in the flames, died without receiving the sacrament of baptism. In the strict Catholic theology of the Marian era, an unbaptized soul carried original sin. and was generally denied entry into heaven, consigned instead to limbo. Bailiff Helyer Gosselin's order to cast the child back into the fire was not merely a physical death sentence. In the eyes of the contemporary religious establishment, it was a spiritual condemnation of an innocent soul. This specific theological horror resonated deeply with the English public. Protestant reformers seized upon this detail. They argued that the Catholic authorities had usurped divine judgment. By actively murdering an infant before it could be baptized, the local magistrates demonstrated a level of cruelty that alienated even moderate Catholics. It provided John Fox and other investigators with undeniable proof that the Marian heresy laws were fundamentally incompatible with basic Christian charity. Thomas Harding and the Catholic apologists completely failed to mitigate this public relations disaster. Their attempts to blame Perotine Massey for her own child's murder were viewed as desperate and callous. The visual and written evidence provided by Fox permanently embedded the image of the burning infant into the national consciousness, severely damaging the long-term viability of Catholicism in England. The enduring legacy of the Guernsey martyrs was not just theological or political. It was profoundly cultural. The island of Guernsey never forgot the events of July 18th, 1556. The brutal execution effectively vaccinated the local population against any future attempts to impose religious uniformity through state violence. As the centuries passed, the exact location of the execution at the Place du Bouillon remained a site of dark historical significance. The local government and the citizens of St. Peter Port passed down the verified accounts of the Cochet family. The story became a foundational element of Guernsey's independent, fiercely Protestant civic identity. The demand for a formal physical memorialization grew over the centuries. On April 24, 1999, more than 400 years after the execution, the island's authorities finally unveiled a permanent tribute. A bronze memorial plaque was permanently affixed to the stone steps of Tower Hill in St. Peter Port. This location sits near the exact geographic coordinates where the 3 wooden stakes were originally driven into the ground. The text on the plaque explicitly names Catherine Cochet, Guillemine Gilbert, and Perotine Massey. Crucially, it also acknowledges the unnamed infant boy. By recording their names in bronze at the site of their deaths, the modern government of Guernsey provided a final physical repudiation of Bailiff Gosselin's actions. The memorial plaque ensures that the victims are not merely footnotes in a 16th century legal ledger. It forces modern residents and visitors to directly confront the historical reality of state-sanctioned violence and the localized corruption that enabled it. The story of Perotine Massey forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. It shows us exactly what happens when religious zealotry is weaponized by greedy, corrupt men. The heresy laws were manipulated to serve local political ambitions, resulting in the complete destruction of a private family. It shows us the terrifying fragility of life when the state decides you are an enemy. A simple act of civic honesty, reporting a stolen silver cup to its rightful owner, was systematically twisted by corrupt magistrates into a capital offense. But the historical record also preserves the moments of profound human decency that defied the tyranny of the state. It shows us William House, a simple gunner, rushing into a scorching fire to save a baby he didn't know. His immediate, instinctive act of bravery stands in stark contrast to the calculated cruelty of the bailiff. It shows us Matthew Cochet, fighting for years to successfully clear his family's name. His relentless pursuit of legal justice eventually forced the English crown to expose and dismantle the local corruption that had murdered his relatives. Most importantly, it shows us that while regimes rise and fall, and while tyrants try to burn the truth has a way of surviving the flames. The evidence was preserved, the corrupt officials were publicly disgraced, and the stolen property was returned. The Guernsey martyrs were not powerful politicians or famous theologians. They were a mother, 2 daughters, and a child who lived for only a few seconds. But their suffering changed the course of history. They remind us that true morality isn't found in the decrees of a monarch or the dogmas of a court, but in the simple, quiet courage of those who refuse to be forgotten.